Bangladesh is burning.
Tonight, celebration on the streets of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. Weeks of deadly protests ousting the country's prime minister from a decade and a half of rule.
Everyone is cheerful. Everyone is celebrating.
More than 200 people have been killed, thousands injured. Tens of thousands have been arrested, and students all across the country have taken the nation by storm. After the protests began in July, the situation became so bad that a nationwide curfew was imposed. Shoot-at-sight orders were given to the police, and even the military was deployed to control the situation. It all started with a Bangladeshi High Court order issued on the 5th of June. The High Court restored a 30% job quota for families of 1971 war freedom fighters. After huge protests, the Supreme Court suspended this order. But the worst was still yet to come. The protesters didn't stop. In fact, they became more intense, and a blunder by the PM only added more fuel to the fire. The PM started taking extremely desperate steps to counter it, one of which was to literally ban their opposition party.
Bangladesh's government has banned the opposition Jamaat al-Islami party.
So let's understand. What was the job quota controversy all about? Why are Bangladeshi citizens against it? And most importantly, what blunders is the Bangladeshi PM making that are fueling the protests? Now, we had a sponsor for this video, but the company decided to pull out last second because of the nature of this topic. So we decided to sponsor our own video. More details at the end of the video. The story begins in 1971, when Bangladesh gained liberation from Pakistan. But this wasn't an easy liberation. The people of Bangladesh, then known as East Pakistan, faced one of the most horrific times in their history during this period. 3 million people died, 200,000 women were raped, and nearly 1 million people fled to neighboring India during this time. This is where we saw the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971. The war in which India, under the leadership of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, helped Bangladesh gain its freedom from West Pakistan. But along with the Indian Army, multiple groups in Bangladesh were also involved in the freedom struggle, one of which was known as Mukti Bahini, which was fighting a guerrilla war against the Pakistan Army. So even these freedom fighters had a crucial role in liberating Bangladesh from the Pakistani forces. Finally, after a bloody struggle, they broke free from the atrocities of the Pakistani army and gained independence in 1971. It was a huge moment for all the people of Bangladesh, because what they achieved was the most precious of things: freedom. To honor the role of the freedom fighters in the independence war, the first president of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, introduced the quota system in 1972, kinda like the veterans' benefits we have here in the US. According to it, a whopping 80% of government jobs were reserved, out of which 30% were allocated to freedom fighters, 10% for women affected by the 1971 war, and 40% for people from poorer areas of the country. Later, the merit-based recruitment was raised to 40% in 1976, which was further increased to 55% by 1996. After multiple changes, this is how the reservation looked by 2018. And the reason we're talking about 2018 is because that has everything to do with the current protests in 2024. The quota system in Bangladesh set aside 30% of seats in public sector jobs and higher education institutions for freedom fighters and later their children and grandchildren, 10% for women, 10% for candidates from underdeveloped districts, another 5% reserved to members of tribal communities and minorities, and 1% was reserved for physically challenged and transgender people. All this resulted in a whopping 56% reservation in the country. You may ask, what about fair competition? Surprisingly, the merit-based quota was only a mere 44%. But there was one problem with this system. In fact, this one factor became the root cause of one of the most violent protests in Bangladesh, and even for everything happening in Bangladesh right now. As we saw, by 2018, the highest level of reservation, i.e. 30%, was given to those connected to the freedom struggle. But a few years ago, 2 changes were made to this quota system that created concern among the youth. The first change was made in 1997, when the government extended the 30% freedom fighter quota to the children of freedom fighters. And later in 2010, it was extended to their grandchildren. But the youth in Bangladesh was against so much reservation for very little percentage of the population. According to them, the quota system was being misused and was creating a new form of injustice. The frustrations among the youth grew, and they felt that 56% reservation was too high, and it was hindering merit-based selection. This concern was growing every passing day, and many youths even started a movement against the quota system. This movement started gaining momentum from the 1990s onwards, but these protests didn't have much impact on the government because of, well, many reasons, like most of these protests were scattered and they were irregular. But every change made to the system was only making matters worse. The opposition to this quota continued to grow and finally erupted in 2018 when students flooded the streets demanding reform. According to the critics, it is justifiable to give a reservation to freedom fighters because they fought for the country's freedom. But extending the reservation to their grandchildren simply because their grandparents were freedom fighters didn't make sense. A series of large-scale protests erupted across the country. These protests were not to scrap the entire quota system, but instead for the reformation of the system. Many students even mentioned that they support reserving jobs for ethnic minorities and people with disabilities. The only problem was with the 30% quota for the children and grandchildren of the freedom fighters. Considering the protests, the then government in power Awami League's Sheikh Hasina scrapped the entire 56% quota. Yeah, you heard that right. She not only scrapped the 30% quota of the freedom fighters, but the entire 56% reservation that included the reservations for women, minorities, and people from underdeveloped areas and physically disabled people. The government eliminated all forms of quotas in first and second class jobs in government employment. So the demands were fulfilled, and Bangladesh finally had a 100% merit-based system after so many decades. But something happened in 2021 that became responsible for the current situation in Bangladesh. A group of petitioners went to the High Court in 2021 and fought a case to get back the 30% freedom fighters reservation in civil services. After a 3-year legal battle, the High Court announced its judgment in a 2024 ruling, a ruling that took the entire nation by storm. On the 5th of June 2024, the High Court not only ordered the restoration of the 30% quota for children of freedom fighters, but also termed the government's decision to scrap the quotas in 2018 as unconstitutional, illegal, and ineffective. What happened next is the result of the current situation in Bangladesh. The streets were flooded with youths protesting against the quota restoration. Now, the major reason why the youth in Bangladesh are so concerned about government jobs is the economic situation in Bangladesh. Inflation is around 10%. Their dollar reserves are shrinking, and the economy has become stagnant. It even knocked on the doors of the IMF and secured a $4.7 billion bailout after struggling to pay for energy imports. In fact, the Bangladeshi PM even requested a $5 billion loan from China this year. But this isn't the only reason. You see, out of a population of 170 million, nearly 32 million young people in Bangladesh are neither employed nor in education. On top of that, job growth in the private sector has become stagnant, and students are facing high unemployment rates. Unlike private jobs, government jobs offer better pay and much more stability. But the reality with government jobs in Bangladesh is that they are very limited, but the demand for them is extremely high. Every year, around 400,000 candidates compete for just about 3,000 civil service jobs. So technically, it looks like almost 134 candidates compete for one job. However, this calculation assumes that there is no reservation system. But with the quota system, the competition has become even more intense for candidates without reservations. On the other hand, it is relatively easier for candidates with reservations to secure a government job. So if this quota was restored, the number of merit-based government jobs would have been reduced. On top of that, critics even today argued that the 30% quota for freedom fighters' families benefits the supporters of the political party in power, Awami League, disproportionately. And they have some fair arguments to support that claim. But if you ask who will decide whether someone was a freedom fighter or not, then the answer is the government. The government decides if a person was a freedom fighter or not. For the past 15 years, the ruling party in Bangladesh has been the Awami League, with Sheikh Hasina as the prime minister. This is the same political party that fought for Bangladesh's independence. Also, at least 60,000 objections have been raised against the names of freedom fighters included in the list. and these objections have yet to be resolved by the government. So these factors became additional reasons for opposing the quota. This is why the High Court order to restore the quota quickly became the hottest topic, and youths started protesting against it. Initially, the protests were carried out peacefully, but because of some incidents, the protests took such a nasty turn that even as the month of August rolls around, Bangladesh is facing the heat of it. The protests were occasionally encountering violence from individuals aligned with the ruling party, Awami League, and its student faction, Bangladesh Chhatra League, or BCL. These protests took an even nastier turn on June 7th, when a Bangladeshi investigative journalist exposed the government. She said, for more than 12 years, questions for the Bangladesh civil service government job exams have been consistently compromised with regular leakage of BCS exam questions. This further fueled the student community and made the protests even worse. The police and military were deployed, and the internet was suspended to bring the protests under control. These measures were supposed to bring the situation under control, but the PM of Bangladesh made such a huge blunder that made the protests even more nasty. On July 14th, Sheikh Hasina made a controversial remark by labeling the protesters as Razakars. At a news conference, she said, and I quote, "Why do they have so much resentment towards freedom fighters? If the grandchildren of the freedom fighters didn't get quota benefits, should the grandchildren of the Razakars get the benefit?" Here, she was pointing out towards the protesters when she mentioned the term Razakars. To make matters worse, even the social welfare minister and the state minister of information and broadcasting made similar statements where they labeled the protesters as Razakars. But what does Razakars mean? And why did this one word worsen the protests? Razakar is a Persian word meaning volunteer or helper. As we already saw, a group named Mukti Bahini fought for the freedom of Bangladesh and were against Pakistan. However, during the 1971 war, the Razakar Bahini was a paramilitary group that supported the West Pakistani Army in Bangladesh. The Razakar Bahini consisted of about 50,000 people who supported the West Pakistan Army and even participated in the atrocities committed against the people of Bangladesh, which was then eastern Pakistan. After the victory of Bangladesh against Pakistan, the Bangladesh government decided to punish these Razakars. In 1973, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman introduced the International Crimes Tribunal Act to identify and punish these Razakars. An anthropologist notes that about 37,000 volunteers were identified, out of which around 26,000 were pardoned by the government, while the rest were punished. Either way, they were imprisoned or their trials are still ongoing. Some trials were so prolonged that, as recently as 2022, 6 members of the Razakar Bahini were sentenced to death for crimes against humanity. So now you know, in Bangladesh, the word Razakar means treacherous and anti-national. Basically, the government was trying to frame the protesters as anti-nationalists. In response to the statement, the protesters started calling her a dictator, with the slogan, "Who are you? Who am I? Razakar, Razakar. Who says that? Who says that? Dictator, dictator." Of course, they say that in Bangladesh, but I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. In fact, there are artworks, memes, rap songs, and slogans circulating on social media calling the prime minister a dictator. And these works are being shared by thousands of people on all social media platforms. Actually, there's also a reason why they started referring to her as a dictator, but first, let's see what was happening in the protests. The government appealed to the Supreme Court against the High Court's order, and on July 10th, the Supreme Court imposed a 1-month stay on the order. But the protests didn't stop, and in fact got some more support from the opposition parties. Apart from the students and the teachers, the opposition parties in Bangladesh, like the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP, also extended their support to the protesters. This was a huge boost to the protesters because BNP is one of the 3 biggest political parties in Bangladesh. These protests kept intensifying each day, and the situation was getting out of control. So, to control them, the government decided to use brute force. To confront the protesters, more than 7,000 paramilitary troops were called. Police started using tear gas, rubber bullets, and sound grenades. Even after so many measures, the protesters didn't stop, and the forces continued using brute force to control the protests. Gradually, these protests began to receive international attention. In fact, even the United Nations Secretary General issued a statement urging the government to avoid using threats or violence against the protesters. The protesters not only faced resistance from the police and paramilitary forces, but also from the BCL, because there were clashes between both of them and both sides were just blaming each other. And as we already saw, the BCL is the student wing of the ruling Awami League party. Meanwhile, the law minister of the government said that the government is willing to talk with the protesters, but the protests just didn't stop. Students started shouting slogans outside Dhaka University, saying they wouldn't let their brother's blood be wasted. Here they were mentioning about the protesters who lost their lives during the protests. But then came the 21st of July, a day when a turnaround was expected. On the 21st, the Supreme Court directed the government to cut the jobs quota for families of freedom fighters from 30% to 5%, and the overall reservation to 7%. Along with the 5%, 1% was reserved for tribal communities, and another 1% for people with disabilities and the transgender community. And the remaining 93% of positions would be decided on merit. After this move, the protests were expected to stop. But surprisingly, they didn't. In fact, they took a completely different turn. Under pressure, the government formed a judicial probe committee to investigate the incidents of violence, but the protesters were now demanding punishment for those responsible for the deaths of their fellow demonstrators. The students even called for a nationwide civil disobedience campaign over the police crackdown on protesters. The ruling party accused the opposition party of hijacking the protests, but the protesters said that they were not aligned with any political group and they just wanted a merit-based system that is fair to all. But the question is, if the quota issue is resolved and the government has sent a probe to investigate the incidents of violence, then why are the protesters still protesting? Experts believe that the protests are no longer just about quotas. The students are now venting out their overall frustration. This mainly includes the employment problem and the political crisis in Bangladesh. Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been in power since 2009. In January 2024, she won her fourth consecutive term, but there were allegations of electoral rigging. In fact, this was such a serious issue that the main opposition party, BNP, even boycotted the election in 2024. So now there are mass protests in Dhaka demanding the prime minister's resignation. Following these protests, the government started desperate steps, one of which looked like this.
Bangladesh's government has banned the opposition Jamaat al-Islami party, as well as the party's student wing and other associated groups. The ruling party blames them for inciting violence during recent student protests.
Yeah, you heard that right. On the 1st of August, the Bangladeshi government banned the opposition and the country's main Islamist party, Jamaat al-Islami party, along with its student wing and other associated groups under anti-terrorism laws. This was done after the violent protests that left more than 200 dead and thousands injured. This was because Jamaat al-Islami was accused of provoking violence during these violent protests. They even termed the party as a militant and terrorist organization. But Jamaat al-Islami has a controversial history. Most of the senior leaders of Jamaat al-Islami have been hanged or jailed since 2013, after courts convicted them of crimes against humanity, including killings, abductions, and rapes in 1971. It was even banned several times in the past. It was banned after Bangladesh's independence in 1971 for its alleged role in the mass killings and atrocities under the administration of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. The ban was lifted in 1976. But in 2013, the High Court disqualified Jamaat al-Islami from elections, which claims that the party's constitution violated the national constitution by opposing secularism. However, it was not barred from conducting political activities such as holding meetings or rallies and making statements. But the current government banned it completely. So this time, we don't have any evidence to determine who was right and who was wrong. The ruling Awami League party even accused the main opposition, Bangladesh Nationalist Party, of taking over the protests because the protesters are demanding Sheikh Hasina's resignation. But even in this case, we have no evidence to confirm whether these claims are true or if they're false. So only time will tell where the situation will ultimately lead the country to. Now, we had a sponsor for this video, but the company decided to pull out last second because of the nature of this topic. But this is kind of the reality of the world. So instead of scrapping the video, we decided to sponsor our own video. I'm sure some of you guys have noticed that whenever you go to your homepage on YouTube, you get some videos recommended from channels that are extremely new. And here's an example. This change is relatively new, and it actually provides a perfect opportunity for new channels to get started and grow quickly. In fact, many channels have used this exact thing to grow an audience in the last 12 months. They've gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. In fact, in just the last 3 years, YouTube has paid out $70 billion to creators. That's around $60 million every single day. So, if you're someone who has an interest in starting a YouTube channel, right now is kind of the perfect time. I've actually made a 30-plus minute guide on how you grow a channel that you can watch right here on YouTube by clicking the card above or the link in the description.